going to start by talking about the Hashish Club, because that's where modern recreational use of cannabis first began. Though we know there must have been centuries of recreational use before that, but the group that formed the Hashish Club in Paris in the early 1840s were mainly writers and artists and musicians, intellectuals, and they formed the club, a private club. They had their meetings or soirees about once a month, and they were closed to everybody else. I was fortunate enough to visit the building where the rooms were, and which is now a private, it's one of the oldest buildings in Paris. When they honor people, they use that hotel just for that. They don't use it for anything else. It was a hotel, and Baudelaire lived there. He had a room in the attic, and he and his friends, Gautier was kind of the central figure, Theophile Gautier. They were young writers at this time. They hadn't produced their great works that made them famous at this point. But hashish came into Paris through the Napoleon's occupation of Egypt. A physician, Dr. Moreau, who had served in Morocco and Algeria and Egypt, brought it back, started experimenting with it, considered it a way of looking at mental illness, but at the same time he tried it and he enjoyed it and he saw the recreational aspects, and he was friends with Baudelaire, Gautier, and Balzac, who was a major coffee drinker, caffeine fiend. But he came and took it a few times. And there were some architects and other well-known figures. But we remember Gautier and Baudelaire the most because, well, Gautier wrote a description of the scene at the Hashish Club. He published it in 1847, after the club had disbanded. And Baudelaire, later, in the 1850s, wrote his great essays on hashish and opium and wine, in which he coined the phrase artificial paradises of the drug experience, which has lived on, even though a lot of people would say they're really natural experiences now. Still, artificial paradises rang true in a way, and still does in a way. The interesting thing about the Hashish Club and recreational use was that just about every aspect of the drug was experienced by the group of writers and intellectuals who took it in those years. For example, they sat down after eating the green paste. It's a confection. It came from Egypt, called majoun, or damaesque actually. Majoun was a slightly different form of it. It was damaesque. Later, majoun was the term. They then sat down to a sumptuous dinner. They hired some of the finest chefs in Paris to cook a dinner for them. They sat at tables and had dinner while the effects of the hashish-laced paste was coming on. By the end of the dinner, they were in a state of hilarity, and besides the chefs, they also had musicians. They hired a string quartet to play at their soiree. And besides the chef and the musicians, they had prostitutes come to visit and spend time. These soirees, which they also called debauches, they lasted a couple of days. They certainly lasted overnight and into the next day. Nobody left at least 24 hours. So they were indulging their senses of elementary and sensual and creative, artistic, musical. And that covers quite a few of the attributes of a good hashish experience. Here's some, I'm going to read some descriptions from Gautier, from his article which appeared in the newspaper in 1847. And that year is kind of important because there was an uprising in 1848. It was a student protest against the government. It was a forerunner of many of the protest movements that happened later, especially the Paris Commune in 1870, when these writers were still alive. There's an engraving of a group of students marching in 1848 through the streets of Paris, the boulevards. One of them is carrying a sign with the word hashish on the sign. So somehow you know this is kind of connected, just like in the 60s, where there's a lot of recreational use of mind-altering substances such as hashish and psychedelics. And there was also a huge protest movement, an anti-war movement, anti-draft. And there was a connection, obviously, between the revolutionary movements and the revolutionary drug. But the drug was revolutionary in 1840, but it wasn't well known. Here are some excerpts from Gautier's description. First of all, the person who gives him his dose tells him, as he handed me my portion, he said, "This will be deducted from your share in paradise." So you can see they had a very high opinion of hashish and what the experience was like. And Gautier goes on to describe the dinner. The dinner was drawing to a close, and some of the more fervent adepts, an interesting use of the word adept, because there was a very strong spiritual, mystical component that was also being examined a few years later. Some of the more fervent adepts were already feeling the effects of the green paste. I myself had undergone a complete transposition of my taste. The water I was drinking I savored like the most delicate wine. The meat turned to raspberries in my mouth. And conversely, I could not have told a cutlet from a peach. A little later, the effects really hit him. All of a sudden, a red flash passed beneath my eyelids. Innumerable candles burst into light, and I felt bathed in a warm, clear glow. I was indeed in the same place, but it was as different as the sketches from the painting. Everything was larger, richer, more gorgeous. Reality served as a point of departure for the splendors of the hallucinations. Next came laughter. A strange character appeared and said in the most mournful tone, "It is today that we must die laughing." That's a pretty extreme way of saying that you're laughing. That's how much they were laughing. And they were ready to die for their laughter. Laughing, laughing, repeated a chorus, a choir of echo-like discordant voices. Soon there was an endless fit of mirth, vibrant, silvery, long explosions of laughter with trills and organ bursts that penetrated my eardrums. The joyous frenzy was at its peak. And I see the word mirth makes me think of the mirth-inspiring bowl in Homer's Odyssey, which Helen, Queen of Troy, gives to Odysseus' son, Telemachus, to help him get over the sadness he has from his father's 20-year disappearance on his voyage. Then the erotic, the sensual. Again, quoting Gautier, "The caressing air made 1,000 voluptuous waves. I watched the garland of ideally beautiful women who diademed a frieze with their divine nudity. I saw the gleam of their satin shoulders, the sparkle of their silvery breasts, the overhead tripping of small pink feet, the undulations of opulent hips. After several minutes of contemplation, I would melt into the object looked at, and thus I was turned into a nymph. That's as strong a description as really has ever appeared in literature of the sensual aspects from the male point of view. 120 years later, in the 1960s, there was an explosion of sex and drug paperbacks. And this was the kind of writing, but it wasn't as good as this. The kind of descriptions that were written to describe the sensual effects. To stay on the subject of the aphrodisiac effects of hashish, around the same time, there was a physician in Philadelphia named Frederick Hollick who went around the country lecturing on all sorts of medical questions that people had. He's kind of like Dr. Phil or Dr. Oz, of his time. And he put out a book on, again, it was 400 or 500 pages on every aspect of everyday medical situations. And had a whole chapter devoted to cannabis, actually. And he described it this way. Cannabis indica, which is most regular in its action, and produces the most constant beneficial effects of anything I've tried. This is actually for impotence. He's talking about sexual dysfunction here. It excites that part of the brain which influences the sexual organs. It also causes a great mental activity, disposes to cheerfulness, and induces a feeling of warmth and comfort over the whole system. He mentions other drugs in this section, including opium and ergot and cantharides, the Spanish fly, even coffee and tobacco. But cannabis is the only substance that merits a full discussion. And he talks about the fact that the native plant, the plant found in the US, in North America, is just as good as that found in the Middle East. I guess there was no reference yet to Mexican or Colombian or Asian hashish. But that physicians were not formulating it in the right dosage. It was usually taken in the form of a tincture. That was one way. The other way was a little later, in the late 1850s and early 60s, during the Civil War period, boatloads of goods from the Middle East, especially from Damascus, brought hashish to the American shores. And it was sold under the name Gunja. It was sold in packages of 6 for $1.50. There's big ads in Harper's Review, and the most popular magazine of its time, for this. And this is one of the ways that Ludlow encountered it, and Louisa May Alcott encountered it in the US in the 60s. Staying with the erotic, moving on to Timothy Leary, he came up with a system called neurologic, which he talked about the different circuits of the nervous system and how different drugs turned on different circuits. The lower circuits were the first 4 circuits. The 4th circuit was the circuit, the coffee, tobacco, alcohol circuits. The 5th circuit, which was the circuit that was that came about from smoking cannabis, he called it the rapture circuit. This is how he described it. The 5th circuit, or the neurosomatic or rapture circuit, is consciousness of the body as an instrument of freedom and pleasure. There is a marked shift from linear visual space to all-encompassing aesthetic sensory space. Perceptions are not so much for their meaning and utility, but for their aesthetic qualities. A hedonic turn-on occurs, a rapturous amusement, a detachment from the previously compulsive mechanism of the first 4 circuits. This circuit is activated by ecstatic experience via the physiological effects of cannabis, hatha yoga, tantra, and Zen meditation. Tantra yoga is the ancient Oriental form of ritualized and stylized erotic communication. And of course the tantrics use cannabis in their process. And Crowley knew about that. I'll get to him in a minute. It's the postponement of orgasm and the prolongation of multi-channel sensory exchange. Leary thought this circuit may have first appeared in the upper classes with the development of leisure class civilizations around 2000 BC. Goes on to say, the trust, humor, transsexual erotic beauty of the rapture linkage is the only platform from which the quest for higher consciousness can be launched. Which is an interesting statement that probably a lot of people would not agree with. But it was that idea of you first have to feel good before you could attain these higher states of consciousness. The person who introduced medical use of cannabis preparations to Western medicine, to modern Western medicine, was William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who was stationed in India, and he discovered its uses. India, of course, is a country then and now saturated in cannabis and hashish. All of Southeast Asia really would grow so plentifully. And he wrote up a report in 1839, and in a way he was writing about a patient of his, and he was really into the strictly medical uses, and I don't know that he even tried it, but in describing the effects of cannabis on one of his patients, it's sort of reminiscent of all the things I've spoken about so far, all the attributes, in a very short paragraph. This is the fourth case in a series that he was performing. The fourth case of trial was an old muscular coolie, a rheumatic malingera, and to him half a grain of hemp resin was given in a little spirit. The first day's report will suffice for all. In 2 hours, the old gentleman became talkative and musical, told several stories, and sang songs, ate the dinner of 2 persons, sought also for other luxuries, and finally fell soundly asleep. So there's a good description of the medical effects, which are very much like the recreational effects that were described by the poets and writers. But probably the person who most described best the mystical or meditative aspects of hashish, cannabis, was Aleister Crowley. And he was, even as a student in Cambridge in late 1890s, he was already experimenting. Very few people were at that time, few. And he was very much into the occult and the means of attaining high consciousness through meditation. So he tried using hashish and then meditating. And in his words, hashish delivers an absolute perfect state of intoxication. One perceives one's thoughts, and nothing but one's thoughts. And it is as thoughts that one perceives them, thus making it the perfect drug for meditation. Hashish gave access to the supreme state of which man has built himself up into God. The drug alone does not do that. It's the dissolving action of the drug on the mind of the adept. And that is sort of reminiscent of how Huxley wrote about LSD and psilocybin later. The filters of the mind, dissolving the filters of the brain. Letting more in than the mechanical thoughts that we usually have. Crowley's aim in using hashish in meditation was to combine mystical states with the precision of modern science. Hashish gives proof of a new order of consciousness that mystics have never properly made the case for. So he had a scientific outlook. He was finding the thing that gave the same thing that mystics found in other ways, or they found it that way, but it wasn't like well known that that was the way it was found. But that's probably the way it was found in antiquity, because Terence McKenna has talked brilliantly about the importance of psychoactive drugs in literally bringing consciousness, speech, higher consciousness, sense of a divine presence before there were societies, when it was just a hunter-gatherer civilization, really before civilization. Crowley went this far. I claim the hashish phenomena as mental phenomena of the first importance, and I demand investigation. This is the year about 1904. I assert that meditation, which he describes as examining one's thoughts under the effects of hashish, will revolutionize our conception of the universe, just as the microscope has done. Leary used the metaphor of the microscope for the LSD experience. To those who claim drugs disturbs the learning faculty, Crowley responded with, it's no different than using a microscope to disturb the learning faculty. He found it unreliable, though, because the dosages were varied, and just like Hollick for him, he demanded that scientists standardize it. That's interesting because there's so much, it's still a factor. The strengths, the THC content of cannabis these days, it still makes all the difference. And Crowley definitely didn't want inferior hashish. Another person who used cannabis for meditation and learned to do this while in India, where it's called ganja. Allen Ginsberg, he went to India in the early 60s, and in Calcutta, he found himself in a circle of Shiva devotees and yogis, and he describes it as ganja led the Hindus to the yogic path, God's gift to friend and stranger, the connection to the divine spirit.
I smoke marijuana every chance I get. I sit in my house for days on end and stare at the roses in the closet. I have mystical visions and cosmic vibrations.
And moving on to the creative uses of cannabis and hashish. And it's really, there were the string quartets, there was the appreciation of music in the 19th century. I don't know how much music was composed on the effects in those days, but jazz is considered to be, you know, the first form of music that has attributes that were enabled by smoking of tea, reefer, in those days, muggles. And the improvisational style of jazz reflects that of the cannabis high. Wordplay, novel perceptions, changing, never playing the same thing the same way a second time or a third time. And an exponent of this, probably the one who best described it, was a man named Mezz Mezzrow, Milton Mezzrow, a jazz musician, started in the 20s and played through the 30s and 40s into the 50s. And this is his description, as a clarinet player, in the jazz movement of his time. This is his Cannabis' first experience playing saxophone in this case, after smoking cannabis. It's from his great autobiography, Really the Blues. He was in a roadhouse in New Orleans in the 1930s when he smoked weed backstage behind the bandstand. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. The marijuana laws were going into effect. He got busted quite a few times. After I finished the weed, I went back to the bandstand. Everything seemed normal. I began to play as usual. I passed a stick of gauge, in another term, around for the other boys to smoke, and we started a set. The first thing I noticed was that I began to hear my saxophone as though it was inside my head. All the other instruments sounded like they were way off in the distance. Then I began to feel the vibrations of the reed much more pronounced against my lip, and my head buzzed like a loudspeaker. I found I was slurring much better and putting just the right feeling into my phrases. I was really coming on. All the notes came out of my horn like they'd already been made up, greased and stuffed into the barrel. So all I had to do was blow a little and send them on their way, one right after the other, never missing, never behind time, all without an ounce of effort. I felt I could go on playing for years without running out of ideas or energy. Suddenly there wasn't a sour note or discord in the world that could bother me. I began to feel very happy and sure of myself. With my loaded horn, I could take all the fist swinging of the world and bringing them all into perfect harmony, spreading peace and joy and relaxation to all the keyed up and punchy people everywhere. I began to preach my millenniums on my horn, leading all the sinners to glory. It's a funny thing about marijuana. When you first begin smoking, you see things in a wonderful, soothing, easygoing new light. All of a sudden, the world is stripped of its dirty gray shrouds and becomes one big belly full of giggles. A spherical laugh, bathed in the brilliant, sparkling colors that hit you like a heat wave. It sort of reminds you of how Gautier described the effects, the laughter, at the Hashish Club 100 years earlier. And back to Mezzrow. Nothing leaves you cold anymore. There's a humorous tickle and great meaning in the least little thing. All your pores open like funnels, your nerve endings stretch their mouths wide. Hungry and thirsty for new sights and sounds and sensations. And every sensation when it comes is the most exciting one you've ever had. You can't get enough of anything. You want to gobble up the whole goddamn universe just for an appetizer. Them first kicks are killer, Jim. Anyway, that's probably how a lot of people experience it, and a lot of musicians. Of course, musicians used other drugs too when they played. But that's always was a popular one. A little after that, George Carlin, and culminating, there were many others, and culminating in the humor of Cheech and Chong, the slapstick, wild, over the top, hothead humor. Cheech and Chong, it was sensationalized really, and they were so good that they captivated the country, and they really were unstoppable until finally they were somewhat stopped. But along with that, there were certain novelists who also made use of wordplay. In a way, the most famous writer who did this was James Joyce, who I don't think there's anything connecting him to cannabis use. But in our own time, writers like Thomas Pynchon and Ken Kesey and many lesser known names produced novels, and generally these novels were very clever, and the dialogue was very witty and very much, the scenes jumped around. Kurt Vonnegut has this also. But actually it was more music and humor than it was like literature and poetry. Well, Prohibition started in the mythical Garden of Eden. Whether there was prohibition before that, probably. But probably the first person who didn't like the other people to get high. Maybe, there are people who have bad experiences. Everybody at some point might, under the setting circumstances. And paranoia is definitely an attribute. Fitzhugh Ludlow, I'm getting off topic here, but Fitzhugh Ludlow had fantastic states of marijuana, hashish intoxication. He also had extreme paranoia. And that came from feeling like he was the only person who was high. And there weren't too many others who were in the 1860s. Although more than we would think, because it was being sold in confectionery stores. Getting back to Prohibition, Adam and Eve were busted because whatever they ate, and there's lots of candidates for what they ate, and all of them could be the right one, and remembering it was a myth, and there wasn't any Adam and Eve and any drug, but at some point, it's the Prohibition myth, and it's God who is like the enforcer. And the reason God comes down on them so heavily is that once they took the substance, the fruit of the tree, they felt like gods themselves. And I guess God didn't want to be supplanted, having God-like experiences. And this is also in that myth, of course, is the serpent, the drug dealer, the pusher. But it's also, the serpent is also the shaman, the holy man who introduces the substance, the plant, to the first people. The history of Prohibition, it really follows this. And of course it's tied into everything else. It's especially tied into economics. But it's tied into, there's so much spiritual competition